this is FontClock. I wrote a version of this application, 5 years or so ago, in a earlier language that you use to program Apple mobile devices as well as MacBooks. Objective-C, that's the language I used. This version, though, is written in the newest language available in the iOS world called Swift. Specifically, it's written with something called SwiftUI, and it's certainly similar to Swift, which is now 5 years old and is based on Objective-C, but is radically different. So effectively, there's now 3 different languages that you can use to write mobile apps. The preferred one is Swift 5.x, but Apple is moving towards kind of a more state-based application programming model, and SwiftUI is the first iteration of that. And to be honest, it's really fun. I used to have to manage things changing and have weird, goofy handlers for events that would occur, and deal with synchronous versus asynchronous application events. And the applications were great, silky smooth, and ran, but a lot of overhead and a lot of code. And the big thing about a lot of code is the more code you have, the more chances you get to screw up, whether it's in writing the application, testing it, or even worse, long-term maintenance. So this will sound totally oxymoronic, but the goal of any programmer is to write as little code as possible, and that's what SwiftUI gives. So what FontClock is basically one of the standard controls you see on mobile apps, or these little picker things that you can zip back and forth to select a date or select a name or whatever. And way back when I wrote the first version of FontClock, I thought this would be a perfect metaphor for a clock, in a real kind of retro way. Like, I think everybody has seen these clocks that have just kind of flip up numbers, and they go clunk, 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 clunk every second as time advances. These were big back in the 50s and 60s before LED clocks came out, but it just seemed to me perfect. It's like, let's create something leading edge that mimics a very retro experience. So anyways, learning how to use Swift UI was also a really enjoyable experience, because the amount of code that you have to put together is really small, and like I said, it's more sort of a state-based programming model as opposed to an event-driven programming model. You still have to handle events, of course, but you kind of wire your application together where all of the things you have basically connections to all of these elements of state. And an example of state, of course, in this application, the most obvious one, is the time. The time is going to change. So when the time changes, that means the state of the application has changed, and of course the state of the user experience has to reflect that. So the old FontClock, there was all sorts of fairly sophisticated timers to watch for this and do that, blah blah blah. But in the SwiftUI world, I basically have I've wired the time to the display, and a lot of the stuff that I used to had to do to respond to that change in state, I no longer have to do. So even me, I'm a real newbie when it comes to SwiftUI applications, and it's anything but perfect yet. It's kind of like a version 1.5 at this point, but I think I'm not sure if I'm going to fully pursue the idea, but I think I'm at a point that it's powerful enough to actually produce a real commercial application to submit to the App Store. At a bare minimum, it's at the level that I would feel comfortable to submit it to the App Store, just to experience the submission and the whole kind of curating process that Apple goes through for their apps. That's a significant part of application development in the mobile world, and it's also one where you literally put your ego on the line, especially as a single, artisan type developer, where it's just you doing everything, marketing, testing, developing, managing, etc. So that process of getting it into the App Store, I find, is the most anxious part. So anyways, getting the picker, which is that control that scrolls up like that running, didn't really take me that long. It took a week or so to get comfortable with SwiftUI, and then literally within like an hour and a half, 2 hours, I put together the basic model, and I was like totally thrilled. It was one of those pat me on the back moments, but it was also one of those, holy cow, is this thing does SwiftUI ever accelerate my productivity? So anyways, that's just the beginning. That was the first half hour, or first hour and a half. And then of course there's the typical developer, oh, I could tweak that, I could make that better, what if it's too small, and then I want to get into the fonts, of course, and how do I do that? And so it was 2 hours to get to the first wow, this is cool moment, and then like 20 hours to get to where it's at now. But even that, that's in a 9 to 5 type of job, that's just a couple of days, or 3 days, 4 days, maybe 5 days if you decide to, like I do, do other stuff during the day as opposed to just programming. So anyways, here it is, and from a functional perspective, you have at the bottom a picker that lets you scroll, and you can pick like really goofy fonts, like for those with their decoder rings, you can tell what time it is, but I don't have mine on. And here's another one, but you can, oh, this looks good, WATTC. So the application interrogates the system fonts, of which there's quite a few. I haven't added it up, but I'm sure there's at least 100. And what the user can do is they can pick a font that they like, and poof, the application is running. At the top you have the date and time in the same font, of course. Then you have these pickers. I'm now using a white background. I thought that gave it a real retro look. I was thinking of putting a pattern like burnished steel or aged wood or something, but I couldn't really figure that out, to be honest. So I said, screw it. Let's see what happens if I make it just pure white. And I said, that's exactly what from a retro perspective, I expect. Now you do a single click inside the picker, and it goes through this hierarchy of, number one, it turns off the scroller, the font scroll at the bottom, and another pick hides the date, and then another click restores both of them. And that was pretty straightforward as well. That's the longest part, believe it or not, was just putting the logic model together, saying, do this, then do that, and then do that. But the real thing, the thing that totally, absolutely thrilled me this morning, was as I was mucking around, I was, installing the app on my iPad and making sure it worked and rotating it and all that. And then I installed it on my phone, and it actually clips on the right-hand side, so I'm going to have to, tune that. And also some of the letters, the way they're kind of positioned within the kind of display space, tend to be clipped at the top, and like I'll show you one, the really flowery fonts. And the one that I noticed that I really like the best, this is a huge font, but as you can see, it's clipping, and that's way below my level of quality, even to the point of just mucking around with the App Store. I'm sure one of the curators in the App Store would say, fine, yeah, whatever, but not me, man. So I got to fix that. But anyways, the thing that really thrilled me, as I was doing this, I realized, like, one of the options to run the app on was my iMac, the system I was developing on. And I said, no, that can't be real, and this is just too easy. So, but I selected that as the target for the simulator, and it pops up and says, oh, by the way, we're going to bundle it, we're going to run it on your iMac, but you might lose some of the functionality because not everything is kind of ready for that type of environment yet. But I ran it and it worked perfectly, beautifully, right there on my Mac, and it was like, holy crap, this suddenly increased my target audience by an order of well, maybe not an order of magnitude. It depends on how many people have Macs versus how many people have phones and iPads. I expect the phone iPad community is much larger than the iMac community, but to be able to develop one application, one code base with no changes whatsoever on all three of those platforms just blew me right away. So anyways, yeah, this is FontClock SwiftUI version Alpha 0.1. And now how do I stop